welcome to all our listeners to another episode of Dadsplaining Politics. It's Frederica, Mark, and today we're welcoming Kylea Tink. So our podcast, for anyone who hasn't listened before, is basically a humble little attempt at talking about current events and everything that's going on in the day. We do it once a week. I am an international relations political science student based in Canberra, and my dad is a technology professional with a keen interest in politics, as a lot of them seem to have. So, Dad, if you want to take it away.
Thanks, Freddie, and welcome, Kylea. Lovely to have you here. We've got a very special guest today on Dadsplaining Politics, Kylea Tink, who is many things, but has been a business leader, a mother of three, up until recently was the community independent MP for our seat of North Sydney, where we live, since May 22, in fact. Time goes quickly. And now since the redistribution and North Sydney has gone away, Kylea is now a director of the Community Independence Movement, and we'll talk more about that in the podcast. But Kylea, it's so lovely to have you here with us today. Thank you for joining us.
It's really lovely to be here, Mark and Freddie, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Question, I think, then.
Yes. So, Kylea, the first question is, what are the best and worst things about your experiences of being the MP for North Sydney over the past few years?
Oh my gosh, that is such a huge question, Mark, because I think, I was speaking at an event late last week, and actually one of the points that was made is that just 1 year in politics is a bit like dog years. It's like 7 years, I think. So even though I've only been an MP for 3 years, it does feel like it's been a lot longer. Obviously, the campaign to make the seat of North Sydney an independent seat began about 12 months before I was finally elected. So it's been an incredibly busy 4 years. In terms of the best things that I've experienced during it is, I would have to say the number one thing is the realization that everyday Australians can have a significant impact on the way our country is governed. I think we are incredibly fortunate to live in one of the few Western nations that you would have to say whose democracy is still pretty strong.
Mm-hmm.
And I put that down to compulsory voting, the preferential flow of voting, and the fact that, we have continued to have an open discussion around politics in this country. I think the worst thing I've seen in the last 3 years would be what I would describe as the lack of ambition and commitment when it comes to the political frame in our nation. We are staring into some pretty big existential threats, whether it is climate change, whether it's the intergenerational inequity in terms of our economy, our housing issues. And to fix those things is going to take not just rhetoric, but courage, and what I think is really bold thinking. And perhaps the number one most frustrating realization of the last 3 years is that the two major parties have got themselves into this mindset that is effectively only ever governing for a 3-year period. They're in it to win it, to have that moment to do what they want to do, and then they need to go straight back into campaigning mode again to win it again, to have the moment to do what they want to do. So it's this very stop-start movement, which is not how you would run any other successful business in the world. To not have a long-term strategy that you sell people on and get them to buy into, I think is a real problem. So the transactional nature of politics in Australia, I would say, is not doing us any justice as a country. And I would really hope in the coming decades, with people like Freddie getting involved, and people like you and I, Mark, still on the edges, we can take our democracy back and actually move our nation into what I believe is its rightful place, which should be as one of the leading, not only democracies, but economies in the world, because we are on the cusp of something quite extraordinary when it becomes to a renewable energy economy. And I just hope our nation can step into it.
I mean, That's actually really interesting to hear all your points on that because I think that everything you've just mentioned is something we've mentioned in a past episode, from the position that like Australia plays as a middle power and the importance of us stepping up in coming years to like the importance of the independence. Because leading on to our next question, I have been in classes doing basic Australian politics lectures, etc., etc., and we were talking about the role of the independence in the Australian like governing system. And the lecturer seemed to think, not, I don't agree with this at all, but the lecturer seemed to think that the independents, yeah, they're doing a great job for now, but they don't have a real interest in politics in the sense that she believes they're a temporary feature of the Australian political landscape rather than an enduring one, because she believes that they'll grow tired of the system at some point and not want to deal with the bureaucracy anymore. I was wondering what your take is on that.
Yeah, can I get her name and number, please? Because it sounds like we need to.
I can try my
Um,
best. I'll ask her next class.
I'm happy to come and do a guest lecture if it helps. I mean, Freddie, the really interesting thing about the whole proposition that it sounds has been put to you by your lecturer is the fact that to me it misses a fundamental truth in our democracy and our constitution, and that is that nowhere in the Australian Constitution is the word party mentioned. Our constitution was fundamentally created to, and at a very problematic stage in our nation's history. We had competing states who were all wanting to be the biggest, loudest voice. It was very ego driven. But at the foundation of those negotiations was the idea that the way to equality across our nation was that every community should have the right to elect somebody that represented them and their values and their ambitions, and to have the power to send that person to a common meeting place. Now, with that as our foundation, the truth of the matter is the independents are the closest thing that we have to the original idea of how our democracy would operate. And, while they have been a long-term feature of our parliamentary system, we've, been a federated nation now for 124 years. It is only in the last sort of decade that really there is this growing momentum to not just send an independent to be a voice in and of itself for the community, but to send an independent who is also capable of working with other independents to actually become a voice for our country. And I think that's the key difference in what we've seen happen since 2013, when Cathy McGowan was first elected, through to 2022, where we had, the election of the largest crossbench in the history of Australian politics. And the counter argument to your lecturer's point, I would suggest, is the fact that coming into the 2025 election, there were actually 50 electorates across the country who had already mobilised and said they wanted to see a community independent run in the 2025 election. Now, of those electorates, 38 found a candidate. And so there are 38 community independents running this time around. That's 1 in 4 electorates will have the chance to vote for a community independent. And I only see that getting bigger because I am already talking to communities who are saying they want to run a community independent in 2028. So, I don't think it is a gross exaggeration to say I sincerely believe we could see a point in this nation where 151 seats have a community independent running. And every time a community independent runs, it's a really good sign for our democracy because it says the people of that electorate are prepared to step into the responsibility of their vote, and they are tired of abdicating that responsibility to two major parties who seem to have completely lost touch with ordinary everyday Australians and our ambitions and our courage and our optimism.
Wow. Yeah, that's amazing. I think I got chills as you went through that. I can understand why they appointed you as the director of the community independence if you're that inspirational just on our podcast. Think of what you could do. Um, but yeah, I think that's really interesting as well, what you said about it being a feature of Australian democracy, having independents representing electorates instead of just the parties. Because I think that you can say that that's a feature of democracy itself. And maybe that's why we're at this state in the world right now where autocracies are gaining more power than they were before, and democratization is completely reversing. Like countries are losing all their faith in the system. And maybe if we had a system similar to what you're describing, where there's individuals representing electorates rather than parties trying to gain like political sway, and power. It all comes down to power, really, right? Maybe the world would be a much better place than it is right now, and maybe all those existential threats we'd actually be working towards fixing rather than just out of sight, out of mind. But no, that's
Hey,
really interesting.
Kylie, a follow-on question for your discussion just there. With some of the funding challenges to the independents, do you see the independents joining some sort of party structure in the future or remaining the way it is?
Yeah, look, I don't know what the future holds, Mark. What I think we can say with absolute confidence is that the legislation that the two major parties colluded to pass through
Hmm.
Parliament in the dying days of the 47th Parliament, the purpose of that legislation was to stymie this movement. There is no other justification for it. And in fact, when you dig under the basics of that, there are some very offensive pieces of content in that legislation that do seek to embed the two-party advantage, and actually, even more offensively, seek to give even more of the public purse to the two major parties. So I think there is, I don't mind saying, there is already talk about how when that legislation comes to be, how can a movement like this one continue to not just survive, but thrive?
Prosper, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that will be the real challenge for people like myself who, no longer sit in a seat, but I am really committed to seeing this movement be given the momentum and the support that it needs. Will it ever become a party per se in what we understand today as a
Yes.
traditional structure of a party? I don't think so. I can't see that working because of the values that we hold. But in fact, it's probably the piece that excites me most about what comes after this election, if that legislation stays in place, is to begin to explore what other models of participatory democracy can be created that would fit within this new, really ridiculous legislation to enable us to be competitive, but not fundamentally walk away from the principles that we hold, so dearly. So I think the beauty of disruption, whether it's in the transport sector, the accommodation sector, the tech sector, people don't see it coming until it happens. And then everybody looks back on it and goes, oh, that seems so obvious. How did we not see that up until now? I feel like that is the potential of this movement. And we won't get it right. Hopefully there'll be lots of failures, because I think you're not trying hard enough if you're not failing every now and then. But I think the fact that there is such an appetite to explore that is really, really exciting, and exciting not just for Australia, but, back to your point, Freddie, for the rest of the world, because we are at a tipping point globally. It isn't just here in Australia. We are seeing the rise of these autocratic systems, even in the US today. Who would have thought the America that we're looking into from the outside would ever come to be in our lifetimes? And so for that to not become the norm, good people must stand up and say, we will not let that happen here, and we will not accept it on the global stage. And I think that's what the community independent movement is in Australia.
Fantastic. And one other just follow-on question before we move on. Why do you think it's taken so long to move to a longer term? Are the major parties against this? It seems like the majority of Australians would be very happy for 4-year terms, for example.
Yeah, well, the history here is there was actually a referendum on this in my lifetime. In fact, when they took the question of the Republic to the Australian community, what we sometimes forget is that there was a second question in that referendum, which actually asked Australians whether they were willing to accept a 4-year term for government. So, I mean, I like to say that's not in the far too distant past, but I don't know, my kids like to remind me that I finished university last century, so it could be longer than I think.
Me
But
too.
yeah, Mark, I think you're right. I think the majority of Australians would absolutely support a 4-year term. I think they understand that the 3-year term has become counterproductive, but it does require a political will to take that to referendum. And I think the results of the referendum that we saw in the 47th Parliament have probably created a bit of a gun-shy recoil when it comes to the Labor Party. I think the Labor Party really took a battering around the voice referendum, even though an electorate like mine and ours voted yes for that voice referendum, which I was very, very proud. The truth of the matter is they're kind of carrying the battle scars. And with the Liberal National Coalition, I mean, I can't keep up with the number of referendums that they've been offering in the lead up to this campaign, but sadly, a 4-year term has not yet been one of them. So again, maybe it comes back to the fact that to have a conversation like that, you have to fundamentally be grounded in a long-term thought process around our democracy. Whereas, to Freddie's point, that long-term thinking is just not there at the moment. It is about power and control. And in fact, in this last term, when I was having conversations that were somewhat frustrated with members of the Labor government, where I was pushing them to go further and harder, particularly around climate laws, the response I got back consistently was, well, Kylie, we can't do anything if we're not in government. So we must maintain power and control, and therefore we will only go as fast as we believe we can go to maintain power and control.
That always seems to be the argument, doesn't it? In every sector of life. I hear that a lot when it comes to what people are planning on doing for their careers. It's always like, let's do something first to make sure we're secure and make sure we have that power, and then we'll do some good things later on. Which can be fair, but it obviously doesn't pose well for politics in general.
Yeah.
I think my dad maybe has some audio difficulties, it seems.
No, I just muted because there was some feedback. So that's fine. Freddie, I think you've got the next question.
Okay, yeah, I'll head on to the next question. So, obviously talking about polarization, I think it's interesting as well. We're talking about the issue of parties and the fact that this party legislation went through, limiting the amount of funding that independent candidates can have is quite interesting in the current frame of today, considering we look at the US system and we see the polarization that's happening there. And I think regardless of whether you support Trump or not, I don't think we like the polarization that's happening in America, the way that identity, destroys like familial relationships and friend relationships. It's so destructive and hurtful to everyone involved that I think both sides of politics there aren't necessarily happy with it, but they don't know what to do to change it. So obviously that has a flow-on effect onto Australia, as American politics typically tends to have. So how do you think that we can combat polarization of Australian society so that we don't exist within echo chambers, and so we can have civilized debate and disagree agreeably rather than catastrophically?
Yeah, it's a great question, Freddie. And I agree with you that it lies at the heart of the democratic movement globally. And, there's probably a lot of reasons that it's happened, not the least being the emergence of the social digital media age, where algorithms will, as you would well know, drive people down a pathway which just seeks to reassert the belief that they're, espousing versus challenging them in those beliefs. I think what's really interesting is that actually there are many eyes across the world watching what's happening in Australia at the moment, because our response is already different. And, I noticed this even straight off the back of the 2022 election. I cannot tell you the number of calls I actually had from international media, things like even, who would have ever thought it, but the French Vogue called me to say, how has this happened? What is going on down there? Because in the democracies where you see that fracturing occur, what hasn't happened is what we've seen here in Australia, which is the rising of the middle. Without exception, the people that are involved in the community independent movement here in Australia at the grassroots are ordinary human beings. I think there were very few people involved in my election in 2022 that had ever had anything to do with politics. But we were all kind of circumspect enough to understand that nobody else was coming to save us. And if we didn't step into that responsibility, then we would lose our chance to complain when it didn't go the way we wanted to see it go. It really was a case of, for me personally, I've been voting since I was 18, which is probably more years than I care to acknowledge. And I felt like I couldn't continue to sit on the edge and complain about the direction the government was going in if I wasn't prepared to stand up and say, well, I don't like it, therefore I've got to turn up, stand up and speak up. And so that rise of the sensible centre is something that is quite uniquely Australian at the moment. But I can absolutely tell you there are people in the US who are reaching out to us right here, right now to say, where did it come from? And, the cynic in me kind of thinks that the independent Kennedy that ran in the US presidential campaign, I think he was trying to tap into it, but he certainly was no community independent. Like, he didn't understand the values of it. He just saw this title and thought, if I grab that and try and market it, maybe I can con a few Americans into supporting me. But I do think that to answer your question on how do we work against it, I think it's got to be in the way that we are prepared to behave in and of ourselves. And it's challenging. Freddie, when I ran in 2022, it was brutal. I was quite shocked at the aggression and the media attacks, the personal attacks on not just me, but my children and my family. You're trying to get me to sit down. It was sit down, shut up, take a back. Excuse my language. I don't know if I can use that, but and I can tell you it's only gotten worse in 2025. And so I think that it's putting pressure on people like myself who came into this space to say politics can be done differently, because you have to be prepared to stand that way and hold it no matter what's coming at you. And, as a communications professional, I guess, I know it's far easier for people to attach to a negative message than it is to attach to a positive message. Fear gazumps hope, unfortunately. And we're seeing a lot of that in this election. If you actually sit and watch the ads that both the major parties are running against each other and the ads they're running against people like me, it is very fear-based. I think the remedy to the fracturing of our society is hope. And in fact, really interestingly, I had someone say to me last week when I was speaking on a panel that he felt the remedy was love. Now, that's probably something that comes from the 1970s flower child era, which you certainly went around for, Freddie, but he might be onto something there, because I think ultimately when you've got people screaming at you and threatening you and yelling at you, your choice is either to respond with a similar energy or to kind of try and see them through the eyes of someone who can kind of go, you're doing that because you're frightened. I'm challenging your status quo. You don't like it. You're trying to intimidate me, but I can get that. That's your thing. I'm not changing who I am. But it is, I know on more than one occasion during the 47th Parliament, there was the debate actually was around how do we create space to have debates where we can agree to disagree respectfully. Because if we get stuck in an environment where it has to be groupthink all the time and anybody who deviates from that is punished or burnt at the stake or, whatever, we will fail, because the only way forward is through controversy and debate and working to come to consensus. So, but yeah, I'm excited because I actually, as I said, I know there are other democracies currently watching Australia to see how this movement grows and looking to emulate it in the future. So maybe in your life, Freddie, you'll see community independence running in the US for the American president, and you'll be able to say, I was there when that took off on the ground in Australia.
Can only hope that we get to the point where Australia influences the US to the point that US influences Australia.
Yeah.
It'd really be a remarkable day.
Kylie, I was just reflecting, well done for dealing with all of that and all that, negative communication, etc. I was just thinking, how do people remain resilient, right? Because the majority of people go into politics to do the right thing by the country and contribute. But it must be somewhat soul destroying sometimes when you get so much negative feedback. I mean, there's a lot of positive, I'm sure, but how do you deal with that?
Mark, it's a really good question, actually. And I confess, at this point in my life, I'm able to reflect. I'm a very different person to the person that ran in 2021 and 2022. I think the things I have learnt about human behaviour and the media environment in Australia and the power of vested interests probably has knocked the stuffing out of me a bit, if I'm completely honest. But I think for me, this might sound kitsch, but honestly, my resilience has been my kids, in terms of the only reason and my my deep understanding of why I said yes when North Sydney's Independent asked me to run, it was never about me. I can honestly say that it was never about me. It was not, I didn't think I had all the answers or I was smarter than anybody else or, but I had two things. One, I really had this like unbiding deep sense that I wanted to be able to look my kids in the eye and their kids and be able to say I did everything I possibly could in the lifetime I was given here to try and leave them a better place. And the second piece of it was I really believed in the people around me who wanted me to do it, my community, like they weren't doing it for the wrong reasons. They were doing it for the right reasons. So I was actually in Queensland recently trying to support the community independents that were running up there. And one of the points I made is I can guarantee you anybody who runs as a community independent is an incredibly courageous person. Doesn't mean they're bullshit. It doesn't mean they're particularly overconfident, but they have courage in bucket loads. But as I said to this one group, those reserves will be sorely tested and probably completely depleted at some point in the campaign. But every person that stands around that candidate as part of the community independent is a little courage battery. And I kind of had said to those who support the candidate, you need to turn up when the candidate's tired and beaten and, just worn out. You need to understand that just as you've chosen them, they've chosen you. And that compact between community and candidate, I think, brings a whole new level of intent to this experience of democracy. So, yeah, it is very different. And, Mark, I feel in some ways the experience I've had is so unique. That seat, 124-year-old seat, we finally win it. I'm the first woman to ever represent it. I'm only the second independent to ever represent it. And 3 years in, they abolish it. Who could write that stuff? But the flip side of that is that I've had the opportunity to go in a really volatile environment, spend 3 years getting to understand this system, and I'm coming out before I'm institutionalized. I am, even though I'm a very different person, I'm fundamentally still the same human being. I don't know if that happens with everyone. I was talking to a senator, Barbara Pocock, who was elected in the same year I was elected, 2022. And she actually made the comment that 3 years in, she was just reflecting on herself going, I'm feeling like I'm becoming institutionalized. The yelling doesn't worry me so much. The intimidation, I just see it as what happens. So her comment to me was, I envy you having that opportunity to leave before you're institutionalized, because you can continue to hold what is quite a pure mirror up to the system and go, yeah, this is where it's broken. I haven't stopped seeing the ugly bits. I see the positive bits. And I think, if there's one thing I would say, it's that there is a huge amount of opportunity in our political system and parliamentary environment in Australia. And that should excite every single Australian. Because break it down, there are 150 people in this country who debate the laws. 150 people. It's such a small number. Yeah. And every one of us has the capacity to influence one of those 150 people. It's whether they listen to us and whether they choose to give their loyalty to us first or a party first. That really decides then what goes on in the chamber. So, yeah, it's pretty exciting, and I'm hopeful that I can continue to advocate around the edges of that to push for change.
Well, Kylie, thank you on behalf of all the residents and citizens of North Sydney. It's been fantastic that you won and you contributed. It kind of sucks that the redistribution happened, but these things happen in life. And I love the way you're turning it into a new opportunity to help the community independents around the country. It's fantastic. Just moving on.
Can I just before you go into the question? No, I just wanted to say, to do with that, thank you for being that pillar of hope that you were talking about, because you have, I think, really become that for the community. And, I can speak for myself and my friends and some of their parents, and just the love and respect for what you have done is being that pure representation that we need in the democracy, and has, equalized us on some level around the country, working towards getting rid of polarization, and you have been embodying everything that you've just been talking about in this episode. So just taking that in mind, we'll go on to the next question. That's right.
Kylie, how do you think Australia should deal with the Trump administration Should we become less reliant on the US? And a little context here, we talk a lot about, we love Mark Carney and what he's doing in Canada. And I actually get frustrated with people when they say, Albo should visit Trump. And, the fact that he hasn't visited means that we've got a bad deal. It really frustrates me, but we'd love your perspective on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it sounds like you and I would be quite aligned when it comes to perspective, Mark. I think the Canadian government, I think, is setting a very good example to the rest of the world. I mean, they share a border with the United States and, therefore have a closer geographical relationship than we have. I don't mind admitting I was somewhat concerned under the last government, in the 46th Parliament, that there seemed to be this reversion of almost isolationism for Australia, a doubling down on our commitment to the US and the UK. AUKUS was all about the old school coming back together, putting the gang back together. And I think the truth of the matter is, for the size of the nation that we are and for the makeup of our current society, we, again, I think, have a really unique opportunity to have multi-partisan treaties. Whether we like it or not, we are fundamentally a part of the Asian part of the globe. And, therefore we must be a leader in this part of the world. We're also part of the Southern Hemisphere, which has perhaps some of the most challenging environments in terms of conflict and inequity, in terms of power and presence in their societies. So my immediate response to that is, it is appropriate that we continue to try and have a positive relationship with the US. But at the same time, the way that US is behaving, that's not on us. And we have to let them own their own stuff. And in the absence of that, we should be seeking to deepen our relationships with organisations like the EU and, broader parts of the Asian continent. And I think we can do that. One of the most interesting things I was involved in while in Parliament were discussions around a new free trade deal with the EU. And it was really interesting that, from my perspective, that fell apart because the EU was asking Australia to be bolder in where we were going in terms of decarbonising our economy. They were basically saying, well, yes, we'll give you free trade access, but we need you to undertake that you're going to be reducing your carbon emissions in your steel and your iron and your exports. We're not just going to let you in with a free pass with high emissions products. Now, the Australian government kind of balked at that and went, well, no, we don't really need that because we've got, the US and we've got wherever else. The upside of the US market becoming more difficult for us is I think it forces our government to look at those other markets, and that compliance piece might actually force us to go further faster. The other thing I must say about the US is actually, and I said this to someone the other day, I mean, America has just fired a massive portion of their nuclear scientists team. Like huge number of academics have been let go and researchers. And I was talking to a gentleman called Saul Griffith, who is, arguably one of the most impressive engineers of a transition to electrifying everything, not only here in Australia, but globally. And I said to Saul, I just don't understand why we wouldn't just step straight in and employ them. Like if Australia wants nuclear submarines and America's just fired the people who are building those things for them in the US, go and employ them, bring them to Australia, move them to Perth and build our own, because I'm pretty sure we'd build it faster than we're ever going to receive it from the US. So I think it's that. And maybe it comes back a bit, Mark, to even the story around the seat of North Sydney. With every disappointment and ending, there is an opportunity. And so I think America is in trouble. I think it's in very, very deep trouble. But I also reflect on the fact that this trouble's been coming for a really long time. I was in Washington in 2005, it must have been, at a meeting where Condoleezza Rice's chief of staff spoke to the global heads of the business that I was with a company called Edelman at the time, and they'd flown all of the country managers in. And there'd just been, the Times magazine had just had a lead story which said that by 2020, the American economy and society would be in decline, and the rising economies would be China and India. And one of my colleagues put to Condoleezza Rice as chief of staff, how did America respond to that? And this gentleman, I just thought so fascinatingly, turned around and said, well, it just means as Americans, we've got to teach them how to do business. We're going to teach the Chinese how to do business. We're going to teach the Indians how to do business. And went on this rant about, America, the land of the free and the whatever. And it was so funny because at the end of it, the head of our Indian operations stood up and very politely looked at this man and he said, with all due respect, sir, I'd like to suggest that by 2020, it will be you who will be learning how to do business the Indian way. And I just thought, so we've known this is
I
coming.
love it.
When people behave in some sort of sense of shock around what we're seeing in America, it's been coming for a really long time, and they need to now decide which way they want to go as a society. And I certainly hope there is enough of a rebound that it brings them back into a place and space where they can continue to be positive contributors. But it is fair to say the world should never rely on one champion. And, I think perhaps that's where this disruption in the States has done some people a favour. I love that the EU has kind of gone, oh, crap, we can't rely on them. We're going to have to take responsibility for ourselves. Yeah, you should. And you should have done it a long time ago.
And Kylie, I love your thought on this in terms of there's an opportunity for middle powers like Australia and Canada and others to really rise up and have this trade agreement with the world, excluding the US, and realize the power of this. It's enormous. If you just think about what's been done with the US bond market recently via Canada and Europe, etc., that's the reason Trump balked on the tariffs. So it's fascinating the power of this collective of all the other countries around the world.
Yeah.
I would just say as well, I think it's like an interesting reminder of how arbitrary everything is and how the system is really just defined by the few people who are in power. And especially everything that Trump's been doing with the tariffs over the past week or so has really shown you that like you can do whatever you want in this system. There may be norms and there may be legislation in place, but nothing can stop you. So the possibilities of free trade with whatever country you choose to do free trade with, whichever one ideologically makes the most sense, there's potential there to follow through on that.
Yeah, and I think, from an economic point of view, we're experiencing it really directly at the moment, Freddie. And the only piece I would say where I think the challenges we are yet to explore them is the challenges around human rights and international law. And I think that is a particular place that we're going to need to focus more in the coming years, because we went through a period as a species in the early 20th century where we did everything we could to destroy each other through the First World War, the Second World War, the Korean War, the Vietnam War. And it's not lost on me that nearly 100 years on, we're back at a point where there's never been as much global conflict as there is right now. Sure, it's not a world war, but there are as many countries currently engaged in conflict as we were engaged back at the same era. Yeah. The concerning piece is we don't seem to have been able to hold on to our global commitment was that around what should be the rules of war. And, to see countries like the US cast aspersions against the United Nations, to cast aspersions against the International Criminal Court, I think that should worry us. And maybe the criticism is fair, but that should prompt a conversation for all of us as citizens about, well, what do those rules need to look like? Because without some sort of rule of international order, we do descend into chaos very, very quickly. So that's a piece I guess I'll be watching very closely, because, America is, to a certain extent, has always been able to be relied upon to be a sort of force of peace. We're not seeing that under Trump. Trump is threatening to blow up everybody from Iran to, he's ready to go. And that's a different America than I think I've seen in my lifetime. So it will be intriguing to see how we respond to that, given that, arguably they are the controller of the weapons industry globally.
I mean, it's interesting that you say that because I think I've heard a lot of people say those are the benefits of the Trump administration. People I don't necessarily have a lot to agree on with when it comes to politics, but respect their opinion anyway.
Yeah.
The benefits are that he is putting the EU and other countries in a position where they have to fend for themselves, and they should have been doing this from the beginning. And so people say, look at what he's doing there. It's just a test. He's sending them out on their own, and then he'll come back and they'll all be mates again. But I think it's that disregard of what's really happening. Everyone has horse blinders on, thinking that since America has always been this way in living memory, for most of us, then they will continue to be this way. But the system is far more arbitrary than they think it is. So it's interesting how that will play out. And I also think with America, it's been interesting to see how they've gone from this global police force, they would call themselves, to what they are today. It is a self-fulfilling prophecy, as you were talking about, because their inability to see how the world is changing around them, and the way that they always look inwards and have such a strong national identity, and don't cooperate as much with other regions, or maybe have as many programs like Erasmus, for example, like in the EU, how different citizens move to different countries and they have the experience and maybe they move there for the rest of their lives. The US isn't doing that with South America, and they never have, because the only true place to live, the only respectful place to live, has always been the United States of America. So maybe that's what has led them into this position. But no, it's really interesting to hear your take on that.
So well
Freddie,
said. Oh,
go
sorry, Mark. I
ahead.
was just going to say the first time I traveled to America, because the company I mentioned earlier is an American company, less than 3% of Americans had a passport. And in fact, most people, when I said I was from Australia, said, oh, yeah, that's that country next to Germany. So I think that's changed. But I think the piece we sometimes overlook as people outside America is that it's called the United States of America because that's how they see themselves. They are not one nation. They are 51, 52, I don't know what it is, but they are separate states who have agreed to pull together to form, this entity called the United States. And so, yeah, I think it is, until you spend time there or working with them directly, or, it's wrong to assume they think. And, we all think differently, but it would,
Yeah.
I think you make a really, really good point, Freddie. And it will resettle, but to your point, Mark, I think the opportunities for us as middle power is huge, and I just hope we can step into it.
Well, if you think about the hollowing out of the United Nations as well, the lack of funding, USAID and there's really a test for the rest of the world. Do we still
100%.
want that order and that United Nations organization, which I think is vitally important? But the US established that and are now no longer interested. So again, there's a sense that it may not be make America great again. It may be make the rest of the world great again, because people need to really step up and take control, which they haven't had to do for a long time.
Yep.
Hey, I'm conscious of time. Freddie, do you want to ask the last question to Kylie?
Yeah, of course. We wanted to finish off with something a little bit more positive. We were just wondering what your personal plans are for the future. So obviously you're now this director of the Community Independent, but where do you think that will go from there? And what other things are you planning on doing? Any holidays or
I wish there was a holiday, Freddie.
yeah.
It's really interesting, actually. I mean, working as an MP is a very bizarre experience because you don't have an employment contract. So you're appointed to the role once the day you win the polls. And then in my case, I lost my job the day the election was called. And I had no line of sight on when that would happen or how that would take place. So, my plans at the moment are very much focused on short term, medium term, and longer term. So short term, I'm very committed to the community independent, movement, and it's really lovely to be able to join the team at the Community Independent Project. They've been around for a long time. They set themselves up in 2021, and I've just joined voluntarily as a board director for them to help them raise the profile of what they're doing. So, and that gives me a great opportunity to work with these 38 candidates that are running in the 2025 election. They're all really, really good people. So whatever I can do to help them and their communities get the best outcome for themselves in this next election, I'll do that. On the other side of that, though, I need to find what's next for me, and it will definitely involve work because I have a mortgage that I, need to pay off, and I kind of feel like it might involve a return for me back to the commercial sector, to be honest, for a little while. I feel like I've probably got another executive role in me before I then potentially turn to boards and broader strategic advice. I'm particularly interested in the capacity of those with a lot of money to do far more good. And so when I talk about that, I'm talking about things like the superannuation sector, for example. There are trillions of dollars invested in super here in Australia. What would it take to unlock that investment to actually redirect back towards the housing crisis we face at the moment? What's going on in the banking sector in Australia, because it's probably the one place I've never really worked. I've never really worked at that intersection between finance and social impact. So at the moment, that's what I'm kind of thinking. But I will continue to try and work within the community independent movement to answer, the question that your dad asked earlier, what happens next? Because I really would like to see a space and a place where you could have somebody like Allegra Spender as the treasurer or Monique Ryan as the health minister. And to get us to that sort of place, we're going to have to continue to push our government system. Do I think I'll ever return to politics? Never say never, but the chances, are probably slim at this point in time. But I'm awfully grateful for the experience I've had, and I think I've put my kids off politics for life, so I've probably done enough good and bad in the same breath. We'll see. But yeah, I always tell my kids, my plan originally was to try and do at least 3 terms as the member for North Sydney. And then my plan was always at the end of that 9 years to go and spend 6 months in Italy, just, living in a villa and eating pasta and bread and, learning the local dialect. So within 9 years, I still hope to be able to do that. But now I've got this, 6-year period to fill with something else. So I'm looking forward to whatever that may be.
Yeah,
correct.
Work.
Correct.
Yeah.
Kylie, I'm sure you'll do amazing things, and you're incredibly skilled. And now, having had your parliamentary experience, there's many precedents of this. Some people haven't been in politics, having great careers in business afterwards, and I'm sure you will do that. Anyone would be lucky to have you. Kylie, thanks so much for your time today. We really, really appreciate it. I'm sure our listeners are going to find this fascinating. Good luck with the community independence. Zali is now our local member, and we will be supporting her. Freddie already organised for a banner on our gate to be delivered early. So it's fantastic. But we really appreciate your time. Thank you for everything you've done for North Sydney and for Australia, and it's been an absolute pleasure.
So great to talk to you both, and thank you for continuing to do the work to actually have exactly the sort of conversations we need to have. I think we need to do more about civic education in Australia, and chats like this are so important in that process. So thank you, Mark. You've been connected to the movement in North Sydney for a really long time, so thank you for that personal support. And Freddie, I look forward to seeing you run as a community independent in some point in time. I'll be right here in your corner.
Good. I mean, if I have support from you, then maybe I'll have to do it.
Bring it on.
Thanks, Kylie. You have a lovely day. Thanks, Freddie.
Thanks,
Bye.
guys. Bye.